Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover Phaedo, a dialogue by Plato. Plato is author 18 out of 200 on my Immortal Books reading list. Well, it's so funny. Before each episode, I get online and I search, how do you pronounce these names? I've just never heard these names, like Phaedo. I've never been in a classroom where we've discussed these names, and so I don't know how to pronounce them properly. And so as I'm reading, if I was actually intelligent, I would do this before I started reading, but I'm not. So as I'm reading, I have in my head the way that I should pronounce these names, but almost inevitably they're wrong. And so right before I do these episodes, I research how you actually say them, and then it's so much different. So I have to consciously think, okay, Phaedo. So anyway, this one is called Phaedo, and it's different than how I have it in my head. But let's get going. What is this one about? Well, it starts off with a question, were you there? And it's the opening line of this dialogue. It's a question that Echecrates asks Phaedo. And it's a question of, were you there with Socrates yourself, Phaedo, the day that he drank the poison? So this is Echecrates asking Phaedo, were you present there in the prison? Were you there when Socrates drank the poison to end his life? Socrates had been sentenced to death by his peers. So there was a period of about a month where he waited between the sentence and the carrying out of the sentence. And so this dialogue is the last day of Socrates' life. There's high drama in the sense of we watch at the end of this dialogue, we watch Socrates take his own life by drinking the hemlock. And it's a very moving scene. And so what do you think would be on Socrates' mind in this situation as he's about to meet his death? Well, his mind is on what comes next, as we would suspect. But it's not a drama in the sense of like weeping and fear and wild, just fear of what comes next. It's a very calm situation. And that's one of the things that just strikes me the most. Socrates is just carrying on as normal. There's a dialogue. He's discussing the soul, the one of the main focus points in this dialogue. But he there's just a calmness about him, and it's really an amazing thing. He is closing out his life. He's ending out his life as he has lived his life. So here are kind of the main parts of this dialogue. Socrates says that the life of the philosopher is a preparation for death. The true philosopher should be denying his or her body their entire life. The body is the temporal. Instead, they should be focusing on the soul, or what is eternal. And so Socrates, to prove that the soul exists, he says when we're learning, what we're actually doing is recalling the forms, and that's forms with kind of like a capital F. And the forms are these unchanging entities and ideas that exist in heaven, something like beauty. And this would be beauty with a capital B. And so we see particular examples of beauty on earth, whether it's a flower, a woman, a landscape. But he says we know this idea of beauty. We know this form of beauty as it exists in heaven, but we know it from recollection. If we know it by recollection, that means we must have encountered it before we were born into our bodies. And this is where Socrates then says and argues that our souls existed before we became embodied, and then that they will continue after our death. These souls are something that are eternal. So after death, our soul will leave the body, and there will be an afterlife. And Socrates then is being rational in this calm willingness to die, because his soul will continue on, and his entire life has actually been a preparation for this moment. When we meet Socrates here in this dialogue, he is 70 years old. He's been condemned by his peers. He's sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. Plato, the writer of this dialogue, at this point in his life is in his late 20s. And what we find out in this dialogue is that Plato is not actually there. And so Plato's relating what Phaedo has seen. And so we kind of go back and forth between Echecrates asking Phaedo about what happened, because he was not there, but Phaedo was. And then Phaedo kind of taking us into that room with Socrates, and we see the final moments, we see the goodbyes, we get insight into this dialogue. We also find out who else is there in the room, and it's quite a number of different people. So this overall is a dialogue about wisdom and about the soul. I read two different versions of this dialogue, and then I consulted the introduction of a third one. So the ones that I read were the one from the Complete Works, edited by John M. Cooper, and Grube is the translator of those. I also read the Oxford World's Classics version of Phaedo, and that one's translated by David Gallop, and then David Gallop also does the introduction for that one as well. And then I read the introduction that's in the Penguin Classics version of The Last Days of Socrates, and that is translated by Hugh Tredennick and then Harold Tarrant. So I think Harold Tarrant is the one that did the introduction in that one. Someone on Twitter X asked me a week or two ago, they said, do you really not understand the arguments when you're reading them to where you need to read them multiple times? And yes, that's the case. And I, especially the first ones here, I wanted to read them multiple times just to make sure that I understood them. And so really, like on the first read through, I would just try to get the main story, the main idea, the main arguments, kind of just to understand overall what's going on. And then the second time, I would really try to focus on particular things and take good notes and that kind of thing. I may kind of go back to this one towards the end of my Plato project and read this one again, just because it is such an important dialogue. But I did read it twice, and I'm glad I did. So it's one of the I've only read a few of them, but I would assume this is one of the more important ones, just because it does cover the death of Socrates, and it is about the soul. So for this podcast, I've just kind of gone through a few introductory items. In the next segment, I want to cover three things that stuck out to me, and then ask a few questions that I'm left with after reading this dialogue. So it's questions that maybe you know the answer to, and you'd love to share those answers, or maybe it's just questions that can get you thinking as well. And then in the third segment, the final segment, I'll cover the one thing that is still got me thinking about this dialogue. Well, there's some really incredible ideas and scenes that are in this particular dialogue. And one of the first things that stuck out to me, and this happens right towards the beginning of the dialogue, is that we enter into this prison room. Socrates is in there, and we see what Socrates is doing. And what he's doing is he's turning Aesop's fables into verse while he's awaiting death. And it's such a shocking thing. There's so many unexpected parts, just in the sense of, I kind of think, like, what would I be doing if I was in this situation? Like, if I knew, like, that evening I was going to have to drink hemlock because I'd been sentenced to death by my peers. Like, what would be going through my mind? Would I be calm? Would I be freaking out? What would I do? And we come across Socrates, and on the day of his death, and he's sitting there writing out Aesop's fables into verse. And so here's the section talking about that. And this is Socrates speaking in this dialogue. After that, I realized that a poet, if he is to be a poet, must compose fables, not arguments. Being no teller of fables myself, I took the stories I knew and had at hand, the fables of Aesop, and I versified the ones I came across, end quote. I just love this idea of Socrates sitting there on his final day. And so Aesop's fables, they could be in poetry or prose. So perhaps he's taking the ones that are in prose, and then he's as he says, versifying them. He's putting them to poetry. And oh man, just that idea. And to think, like, Socrates didn't write anything down that I believe that we know of. And so Plato did that on his behalf, and that's where we get these dialogues. So many of Plato's dialogues are about Socrates, but Socrates wasn't writing these down. Plato was, and Plato would have been doing that in prose writing as opposed to poetry writing. And so you just think of Socrates, his whole life would have been prose in the sense of like what he's doing. He's offering arguments and asking questions. This would have been verbally, it would have been prose. And yet here he is in his final month of life and now on his final day of life, and he is writing poetry. I just love the idea of that. I love everything about that, and was really struck by that. It kind of reminded me, it's said that C.S. Lewis kind of in his final weeks of life, he was reading the Iliad again in Greek. And that was perhaps one of the final things that he read in his life. But just, I'm always curious, like what are people doing at the end of their lives? And this picture of Socrates versifying Aesop's fables is such a beautiful picture. Second thing I want to highlight is that of judgment. There's a really neat idea. So there's a lot of talk in this particular dialogue. Obviously, it's about the soul, and so Socrates is talking about what happens with the soul? Like, what are you doing? How are you cultivating your soul within your life? And then what does that mean in the next life? What does that mean in the afterlife? And I'll hit on this a little bit more in the next segment, but there's one idea here that is just really interesting. And it's that of those who have committed murder in their lives and they've killed somebody, and now we're looking at them in the afterlife. And so here are these people who have killed somebody, and then here is what they must do. After they have been carried along to the Achersian lake, they cry out and shout, some for those they have killed, others for those they have maltreated. In calling them, they then pray to them and beg them to allow them to step out into the lake and to receive them. If they persuade them, they do step out and their punishment comes to an end. If they do not, they are taken back into Tartarus and from there into the rivers. And this does not stop until they have persuaded those they have wronged, for this is the punishment which the judges imposed on them. End quote. And so there's this idea, if you have maltreated somebody or if you have killed them, in the afterlife, you're in a particular place and you must reach out to that person that you have wronged or you have killed, and you must persuade them for them to allow you to step out of that spot. And I just kind of wonder if this is the first inklings of the idea of forgiveness. It's nowhere near the idea of forgiveness, but it's getting there in the sense of the person who did the wrong must persuade the person they wronged to allow them out. And it's amazing to see that here. I'll get into that a little bit in the next segment, but that is something that really stuck out to me in this. The final thing that really stuck out is at the very end, and this is when Socrates is drinking the hemlock, and this is what it says. And whilst he was saying this, he was holding the cup and then drained it calmly and easily. End quote. I mentioned that in the first segment, just how calm Socrates is throughout this particular dialogue, especially with what is about to happen to him. And even in that final act of drinking the cup of hemlock, which is going to start his quick death, he drained it calmly and easily. And the people around him, they start weeping, and he tells them to quiet down. He wants to die in peace. He doesn't want wailing and all that around him. And that's just something that stuck out so strongly in this particular dialogue of the calmness of Socrates. Next, I want to share some questions that I have. Some of these may seem obvious. The answer may seem obvious to you, but they're just questions I would write. And this is a habit that I have. And it's a habit I really like. And I really started doing this a lot when I start each year reading straight through a different version of the Bible. And what I do is as I come across things that I don't understand, I write out the question in the margin. And my hope, so one thing I don't do after I do that, I don't go to Google or I don't call up a friend or something and ask them what they think. I just write that question there and let it sit there. Because what I found is if I then like immediately go look for the answer, I may find like a quick answer, but it's usually not like a very good answer. And then I'm apt not to remember it because there's almost like I need to struggle a little bit. I need to battle it out to get the answer. And so what's really neat with the Bible is oftentimes I'll write a question and then I will find the answer later on in the Bible. And so this is kind of my idea here with these questions on Plato that came up in this dialogue. I want to present the questions here. If you have an answer, I'd love to hear what your answer is. I'd love to know how you think, and if you write those in on the Substack page just so other people can see them as well. But mainly I want to do this so I have this set of questions out there, and I'm really curious to see if they're answered in other dialogues by Plato. Or perhaps Aristotle takes up these questions later on, or perhaps someone else in the great books list takes on these questions, or I can find them somewhere else. So let me just share. I've got 6 different questions here, if you will indulge me on these. The first one is, did Plato think a god had created these souls? So kind of the bigger question there is, where did the soul come from? Was it just pre-existing for all time, all eternity, or was it created at some point in a different realm in heaven, or who created these and where do they come from? The second is the recollection idea is intriguing. Is that similar to our modern conception of either a conscience or things that we do instinctually, or is it something completely different? So that's question number 2. Question number 3, what is the Christian answer to forms? Are these attributes of God, or is it something else? So these capital F forms or ideas that Socrates says exist here in the eternal. How does Christianity present that idea? The fourth question is the body itself bad, or are the desires of the body bad? There's this sense that throughout this dialogue that the body is always in conflict with the soul in the pursuit of truth, because the body needs food and water and sleep and sex, and so that's diverting the philosopher from the good things that they should be seeking after. So there is this idea of obviously a duality here between body and soul, but then also that some of the items or things associated with the body are bad. Number 5, is the soul altogether immortal, or can it be damaged? So there's talk in this dialogue of a damaged soul, and it's oftentimes it comes up as a question of can you damage a soul? Like, can it reach the next life damaged, or is it always kind of all together? So that's a 5th question. And then how does this differ from? Hold on one second. How does this differ from the biblical view of souls and new bodies? So in the Bible, we're told in the afterlife we'll have a new body, whereas what it seemed like in this dialogue is that it's just the soul that goes to the next world, and there's not a new body. It's just that you're a soul in heaven or Hades or the afterlife. So those are my set of questions. I will next segment here I'll get into the one thing I'm still thinking about after reading Phaedo by Plato. Well, if you've listened to other episodes of this podcast, you know a big item of interest to me is the afterlife, and particularly just how ideas of the afterlife kind of came into being, or how they developed over time. And so I in the year 2020, I read straight through the Bible, and that was the first time I'd ever just done that straight through, just within a 2-month period, so a rather fast time period, and then from start to finish. And I was just struck by the lack of mentions of heaven, especially in the Hebrew Bible. There would be that God was in heaven. There was mentions of Hades, but not this heaven hell that at least I hear about so often. And so that just struck me. And as I've been reading other ancient works, I'm just very curious as to how these ideas came about, and what did the ancient Greeks believe? What did the ancient Babylonians believe about these things? And when Hades is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, is that the same idea that the Greeks had of Hades? Are we talking about the same thing there? And so I'm just always curious as to what we're finding here. And so when I came across Homer and I'm reading the Odyssey and we see Odysseus go down to Hades, there's this idea that the people are mere shades of what they were in life. And life was where the glory takes place, and your everlasting name, that happens with honor and what you do in life. But then you get to this afterlife and it's just kind of a blah situation, and there's nothing really compelling of it. I don't see how it would really make someone want to be there. No matter how glorious you were, like Achilles during your life, you're just like the shade in Hades. But then we also learn that Helen of Troy, she gets to go to the Elysian fields. And so there's some sort of a distinction where some people go one place, other people go another place. But then you're kind of left with, well, why did Helen get to go to the Elysian fields? Why did she get the better place and Achilles didn't, or Agamemnon didn't? Like, why? But here in this dialogue, it's a much broader view and a richer view of the afterlife, especially if we compare that to Homer. So let me start just by reading a few things Socrates says as he's about to die. He says this: "Be assured that as it is, I expect to join the company of good men. I have good hope that some future awaits men after death, as we have been told for years, a much better future for the good than for the wicked." End quote. So first off, there even in those few sentences, there's a much different view of the afterlife, and there's a view first that Socrates expects to join the good company, the good men, but then that there is going to be a distinction between the future for those who have done good compared to those who have done wicked, and so you just see that distinction there. Now let me go more towards the end of this dialogue and read a paragraph here. "It is right to think then, gentlemen, that if the soul is immortal, it requires our care not only for the time we call our life, but for the sake of all time, in that one is in terrible danger if one does not give it that care. If death were escape from everything, it would be a great boon to the wicked to get rid of the body and of their wickedness together with their soul. But now that the soul appears to be immortal, there is no escape from evil or salvation for it except by becoming as good and wise as possible. For the soul goes to the underworld possessing nothing but its education and upbringing, which are said to bring the greatest benefit or harm to the dead right at the beginning of the journey yonder." End quote. So now you get the idea that, as it's eloquently put in the movie Gladiator, what we do in life echoes in eternity. There's this idea that things will cling to your soul, and there's the goodness, but then the wickedness that follows you. And if the soul is immortal, then it really matters what you do on earth. And I don't know enough about this yet to know if this is one of the first times we're seeing this in literature or not. I do have a book that I plan to read at some point that goes through the ancient literature on the afterlife and on heaven and hell. And so I look forward to reading that, and maybe that book will answer this question. But I was really intrigued to come across this, and kind of a deeper working out than what we see in Homer 400 or 500 years before this work by Plato here. It reminds me of this statement by C.S. Lewis where he says, "You don't have a soul, you are a soul." And that's really kind of what we're starting to see here of what Socrates is saying. It's almost as if the body is getting in the way of the soul and of the life of the philosopher. So just really interesting stuff. I enjoyed this dialogue quite a bit. So in conclusion, this is high drama, but not in the expected front. The death itself only takes 2 or 3 pages, and it's many-page dialogue. And so the majority of it is actually this back and forth about the soul. It's these questions about what happens when you die, and this idea of forms or ideas that exist in heaven, and then we see little glimpses of that here on earth. So there's not this weeping and wailing and throughout this dialogue, but it's really more of a reasoned dialogue taking place amidst high drama. And Socrates goes out as he lived. He goes out calm. It's really incredible. It reminded me of the story. David Goggins, the Navy SEAL, ex-Navy SEAL, the ultra runner and all that. He tells this story about when he was young and he was with his grandfather, and his grandfather was with his friend, and they were working on this car, and his grandfather had his hands on the hood and the body of the car, and the hood was up, and the neighbor, unbeknownst to Goggins' grandfather, the neighbor closes the hood of the car where Goggins' grandfather's hands are. And so it just smashes his hands. And I can't think of much that's worse than that. And so his hands are just smashed. And Goggins said his grandfather just stood there and did not scream, did not do anything, just stood there stoically while the neighbor unleashed the hood, got it back up. And just the stoic nature of that was just, it just made such an impression on Goggins. You get a sense here of amidst impending death here, there's this calmness, there's a gravitas to the person of Socrates. One of the introductions I read, it said, it's better to read this as a philosophical memoir than as a biographical record. So whether this is exactly how things happened on the final day of Socrates' life, we don't know. Maybe not. Probably not. Plato wasn't there. But there's some really amazing philosophical ideas here. If you're choosing which Plato dialogues to read and you are only going to read a few of them, this should definitely be on that list. That's going to do it for this episode. In terms of what I have next, I am trying to read the complete works of Plato. That I'm only 5 in, and I think there's over 40. So it is a slow-going process, but I do think it's going to pick up now. I wanted to spend more time on these initial ones just to kind of get my mind in the mode of philosophy and in dialogues. And so I think the ones going forward now, unless they're like his major ones like the Republic or the Symposium, I'll probably just read the upcoming ones just once as opposed to 2 or 3 times. The other thing that's coming up in the month of October here is I will be reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and I'll be leading a reading group on that. If you would like to join that, we're going to be meeting the second week of, I think that's going to be October 15th. We're going to meet online. So you can join via Zoom. All you have to do is become a paid subscriber to the Books of Titan Substack. I have plans for as little as $5 per month. And if you're a part of that, you'll get that email showing the Zoom information to join that call. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you have answers to some of those questions that I asked. I'd love to hear your thoughts as I kind of build up my answers to those questions. I'd love if you would respond on Substack there where others can see and comment on that as well. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and the website is stock full of resources to help you find the best books and to create your own reading list. I'll be back next week, and I'll be discussing another dialogue of Plato. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.